Welcome. I'm Eric Fleming, host of A Moment with Eric Fleming, the podcast of our time. I want to personally thank you for listening to the podcast. If you like what you're hearing, then I need you to do a few things. First, I need subscribers. I'm on Patreon at patreon.com/A Moment with Eric Fleming. Your subscription allows an independent podcaster like me the freedom to speak truth to power and to expand and improve the show. Second, leave a 5-star review for the podcast on the streaming service you listen to it. That will help the podcast tremendously. Third, go to the website, momenteric.com. There you can subscribe to the podcast, leave reviews and comments, listen to past episodes, and even learn a little bit about your host. Lastly, don't keep this a secret like it's your own personal guilty pleasure. Tell someone else about the podcast. Encourage others to listen to the podcast and share the podcast on your social media platforms because it is time to make this moment a movement. Thanks in advance for supporting the podcast of our time. I hope you enjoy this episode as well. Hello, welcome to another Moment with Eric Fleming. I am your host, Eric Fleming. And, as always, we've got a great show for you. I have a couple of guests today that I think should give you some inspiration and some guidance on how to navigate and participate in our current political climate. I'm really honored to have had these guests come on, and I think you'll gain something from their expertise. Having said all that, you know what time it is, ladies and gentlemen. It is time for a moment of news with Grace G.
Thanks, Eric. President Joe Biden and former President Donald Trump have secured their respective parties' nominations, setting up a presidential election rematch. This following a forceful State of the Union address by President Biden criticizing Donald Trump and outlining his case for re-election. Some charges against Donald Trump in the Georgia election subversion case were dismissed, but the central racketeering charge remains. The U.S. House passed a bill targeting TikTok, which could lead to a ban if the Chinese-owned app's U.S. assets are not divested. The centrist political group No Labels is preparing to announce a presidential ticket soon, despite concerns about finding suitable candidates for a third-party challenge. Department of Housing and Urban Development Secretary Marcia Fudge announced her retirement after an extensive career in public service effective March 22nd. Donald Trump's influence on the Republican National Committee was reinforced with the appointment of Laura Trump and Michael Whatley to top leadership roles in the party. Republican Representative Ken Buck of Colorado will leave Congress early, citing a breakdown of civility. Oregon Governor Tina Kotek signed a bill to recriminalize drug use, rolling back the state's previous decriminalization of lesser amounts of drugs. The police chief of Uvalde, Texas, resigned after an independent investigation cleared officers of wrongdoing in the 2022 school shooting, which contrasts previous critical reports. Donald Trump posted a $91.6 million bond as he appeals a defamation verdict in favor of writer E. Jean Carroll, who accused him of rape. 2 soldiers and a U.S. Border Patrol agent died when a UH-72 Lakota helicopter crashed in Texas while on patrol along the U.S.-Mexico border. A federal judge in Texas dismissed a lawsuit by Republican-led states challenging the Biden administration's migrant entry program. And the U.S. saw an increase in the unemployment rate to 3.9% in February. I am Grace G., and this has been A Moment of News.
All right. Thank you, Grace, for that moment of news. And now it is time for our first guest, Corey Nathan. Corey Nathan started out as a stockbroker during the day while he was studying at a theater conservatory at night. Since then, he's been an entrepreneur with one foot in business and one foot in creative pursuits, having built and managed such endeavors as a specialty headhunting firm, a theater and film ensemble, a residential and commercial service company, a 501c3 to help folks during the pandemic, and most recently, a new media/content company. Personally, Corey was raised in an observant Jewish household, attending an Orthodox synagogue. His family is mostly from Brooklyn, New York, but Corey grew up on the Jersey side, Bruce Springsteen country. In his late 20s, much to his family's chagrin, Corey became a born-again Christian. Not long after this epiphany, however, the new believer began to find many of the prevailing social and political positions of contemporary American evangelicalism to be at odds with the very scriptures that are supposed to be the Christian's authority for how to engage in the world. This background lends itself to the program he produces and hosts, Talkin Politics and Religion Without Killing Each Other, on which world-renowned guests join in on conversations that take some of the space in the public square back from the screamers and extremists who've taken it over. Corey has been married to Lisa for almost 25 years and has 3 kids, Savannah, 21, Jackie Boy, 18, and Emerson, 17, along with the family pooches, Bailey and Charles Mingus III. As for rumors of his exploits in the world of Texas Hold'em poker, we can neither confirm nor deny those reports. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my distinct honor and privilege to have as a guest on this podcast, Corey Nathan. All right, Corey Nathan. How you doing, my man? You doing good?
I'm doing good, Eric. I really appreciate you including me in the conversation.
Well, you caught my attention because of this show where you want to teach people how to talk about politics and religion without killing each other. So in this day and age, I figured, hey, that'd probably be a good guy to have on the podcast because we really need to have that conversation, especially with the dynamics that are going on here in America and abroad, that a lot of the conflicts are either political or religious or both. So I wanted to get your expertise on having those kind of conversations.
Well, just to clarify, I don't consider myself the expert. I consider myself the patient in need of the most care of this disease. Because, man, I do often find myself in conversations where I lose it. I do not exemplify the virtues that I'd like to see. So part of the reason, just to be totally candid, that I started this program was so that I can learn how to do it better.
Yeah.
And if I can learn, I can't control the whole country. I can't even control my whole house for that matter. But I think I can have a little bit of control on working on better habits of how to engage in the conversations that I'm in. So that's one of the main reasons I started the program in the first place.
Yeah, and and that was kind of the same thing with me. Initially, my podcast started off as a rant, because the former president, would tweet something, and I'd get so angry I would just pull over my car when I was Ubering and just would vent and record it. And then some of my friends.
So I'm assuming we're not talking about Barack Obama, right?
Right. And so some of my friends just said, you ought to do a podcast. Everybody's doing that. Why don't you do a podcast with your recordings? Yeah. And so as it's evolved to a point where I'm having guests, the one thing I wanted to do was to have a conversation and not, a verbal fight. Regardless of your position, I wanted you to have your say. And if I want to say something about it, it's my show. I can plug in whatever editorial content I want afterwards. But if I invited you on the show, I want you to talk about your viewpoints. And I think that goes a long way in, expanding and improving the dialogue. But anyway, enough about me. So first, what I normally do with a guest is that I have a quote for them. And it's either something they might have said, something that they might have written, or something relating to the topic. So this is your quote. We can learn about each other across our differences. We don't have to come to conclusions or even find common ground. What does that quote mean to you?
It makes sense, man. Like, I think that, I don't know if I said that directly, but it sounds like something that I would read. So it just resonates with a lot of what I'm realizing is that oftentimes we come into these conversations and we immediately kick into contentious mode. Like, I got to debate with you. I got to get my point in. I'm going to win this transaction, And I don't think that is particularly productive for anybody involved, even those who are maybe just listening, if it's a digital conversation and people are like reading the thread or whatever, or if it's one of these conversations that people are listening in on it. I don't think it's a particularly productive way going about it. It's transactional and it's contentious. I think a much more productive way of going about these types of conversations is first and foremost not transactional but relational, not contentious but connected, but like seeking with a sense of radical curiosity of, I didn't think of it that way. Tell me more. Why do you believe that? Tell me about your life. How did you arrive at that conclusion, kind of a thing? And in building relationship, it gives us a much more fertile ground to actually persuade each other, ironically, So that's what that quote makes me think of. And I think we need that because there's so much that's splitting us apart, whether it's people who are moving to a different area because there's too many of those blue folks over there, too many of those, red hat wearers over there. Like, people are moving different places. People are only watching certain TV shows. People are only listening to certain podcasts. They're doing what's called bespoke realities. They're creating a whole bespoke reality so they don't have to deal with, quote unquote, them, right? So, but what we need, we can't do this thing alone. That's why we need to talk about politics and religion. We can't do this thing alone. I mean, there's some people, right, here and there, arbitrary, just like the random wild card that goes out and lives out in the woods all by themselves, has no contact with anybody. But I mean, that's kind of like if a tree falls in the woods, does it make a noise? If a person lives out in the woods and doesn't come in contact with anybody, is it really a life? I mean, that's a whole philosophical inquiry, and we could talk about that. But the rest of us, the 99.9999% of us, we're coming in contact with each other, so we got to figure out how to do this thing better. And how do you do that? Not by banging each other over the head with the perfect rhetorical 3-word, comeback for everything, but by connecting with each other, by building relationships with each other across our differences. Because you have a different life, even if we believe a lot of the same things or vote a lot of the same way, you have a different life experience than I do. And at some point, we're going to come across something that we differ on. How do we navigate that together as a community, as a beloved community? Right? That's what, I don't know. So now you got me thinking, but that's a bunch of the stuff that it makes me think about.
Well, I don't know if you have a disclaimer that it's dangerous when you think, but I like people when they think and when they give an answer. So don't feel offended by that. Which you kind of, I think, answered the next question, not unless there's something else you want to expound on. But I was going to say, so how do you talk about politics and religion without killing each other? And I think you kind of laid the foundation for that, especially the part where you're not trying to make it transactional, right?
Right.
Right. I think that if you allow people to express themselves and you kind of feed off of how they're expressing themselves and get a better understanding, then you can kind of navigate and get to a solution. As a legislator, I had to learn that because when I got in the legislature, Corey, I was hell on wheels. I mean, I was speaking against bills literally my second day in the building. And everybody was like, we don't even know what this bill says. How the hell is he speaking? You know what I'm saying? And
you know, that reminds me of Teddy Roosevelt was that way when he first got into the legislature as a young legislator, you know?
Yeah.
Hey, who is this guy? Did he actually read the bills? Yeah, he did. You know, he's got something to say about it.
Yeah. And so
cool.
what I had to learn was that legislation wasn't like the Schoolhouse Rock video. That it was about relationships. And when I started going to the committee dinners, where these lobbyists would take the whole committee out to eat whatever, you know, and we started exchanging stories and sitting next to each other, and and I, on one committee, I was literally the only black guy on the committee, and so only black person, and there was only one, and that was funny because there was only one woman on the committee, and so we used to call ourselves the diversity subcommittee, and all the lobbyists used to laugh about that. But it was being in those dinners that I started developing relationships, and so it didn't matter what side of the aisle they were on, what part of the state of Mississippi they were from. If I said something or I made a point, they were more understanding of it instead of just looking at me as somebody trying to get attention or something else. So to understand that relationships are a give and take, I think is fundamental. Would it be safe to assume that your conversion from Judaism to Christianity played a part in looking for a healthy dialogue between differing views?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, because when I became a Christian, as you can imagine, I had to go back and share the news with my family. And my father in particular was not very enthusiastic about this evolution of mine, the spiritual evolution of mine. And especially that particular going from Judaism to Christianity, because we have a long history of men wearing crosses on their chests that come through our town swinging swords and burning down our houses and doing even worse things for centuries, some of which I know because I'm only a generation removed from that sort of thing happening. So the idea that one of Chaim Reuben, his sons, that's his Hebrew name, becoming a Christian and at least proverbially wearing that cross, that was anathema. So I had to have very, very hard conversations with family and with friends. And, the relationship thing, I give my father a lot of credit because he won't own up to it now, but his first reaction was he wanted to do what's called sitting Shiva, which is a ritual that Jews go through when somebody in the immediate family dies or if someone is dead to you. So that was his first thought. He didn't do that because I believe that the guilt of a Jewish mother, trumps the convictions of a Jewish father. So my mother convinced him not to do it. But that allowed him some time to consider the fact that his relationship with his son was more important than even these deeply held generational convictions. So that's why we stayed in the game, man. He sent me this 10-page single-spaced letter about a month after I told him, telling me all the reasons why I can't, I mustn't, I shouldn't, this can't happen kind of thing, and he outlined it in all different kinds of ways, like historical, emotional, filial, theological, political. He just approached it for all kinds of ways. But that letter was the beginning of a conversation. This is going over 20 years ago. This was he sent me that letter in December of 2000. We're still having the conversation based on that letter. We've been having it for over 20 years now. So, and it's because he came to that conclusion. Relationship with his son was more important than his deeply held beliefs as a Jew, So, yeah, that's part of where it started. But the other thing is, I started going to church when I became a Christian, and I realized, oh man, I'm here because I believed in the teachings and the profundity of a risen Yeshua ben Yosef, a risen Jesus, right? And I'm not here, like I'm sure not everyone, maybe not all your listeners are Christians. I'm not here to share the gospel or anything like that. I'm just telling you my story and how it affected me. When I read about Jesus in the gospel accounts for the first time, I was reading a rabbi teaching his disciples. And I was there as a disciple being profoundly affected by his, what we think of in Judaism as Devar Torahs. But when I got to church, I realized that what changed my life and my worldview and my everything, that was not what brought a lot of the people to church that I was going to church with. That was not top of mind for them. What was top of mind for a lot of, and I consider them buddies, what was top of mind for a lot of guys I was in Bible study with, a Sunday school class with, was political and social preferences, even prejudices, I'll say. That if Scripture was at odds with some of their, a priori preferences, they would pick their political views over what Scripture was screaming at them, right? So I say that because that meant I had to have some really challenging conversations about politics and social issues around the Bible, around what Scripture was saying. And then just over the years, I just realized, man, and why we started the program.
All right. So part of that got cut out. Part of the answer got cut out. But you were talking about, you had come to a realization about, just repeat, you had come to a realization that you had to have these conversations with your church buddies about the Scripture. Kind of as close as you can, repeat what you just said.
Sure. Yeah. So I realized that as much as I was convicted by the messiahship of this Jesus, the Rabbi Jesus, as I thought of him. The people I was going to church with, their order of priorities, Scripture and Jesus, they wouldn't admit to it, but it was down the list. Their political preferences, their social prejudices, those would take precedence if it was at odds with Scripture. So I had some very challenging conversations in Bible studies, Sunday school. I was kicked out of a couple Bible studies because I'm reading Leviticus 19 and getting to the end of the chapter. I'm thinking, it's saying something about immigration that y'all don't like to hear. But are we going to read Scripture? Are we going to say it's authority or not? Now listen, I'm still a Jew from Jersey, so I'm going to come at it with some sharp elbows. So maybe that might have been the reason I got kicked out. But I think the main reason was I see something in Scripture black and white. If we're reading it, and we're not just taking a shard of Scripture here and a little fragment of Scripture there, but if we're reading it, then it's saying something that you don't like because it's at odds with what you just heard on Fox News or your favorite podcast, So I had to have some really hard conversations. And like I said at the get-go, I needed to figure out how to do it better, how to exemplify the fruit of the Spirit, because, man, we got to – that doesn't come naturally to guys like me. The love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, gentleness, self-control, faithfulness. This does not come easily to me. So I had to – that's another reason why we started it, is because I wanted to do it better. I wanted to do it in a more winsome way with gentleness and respect, So, yeah, it's all tied up with why we started that show.
And just to put it into context, you converted to Christianity when you were 20.
29. I was in my late 20s. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So now you've been on this Christian journey for about as long.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So, you've kind of done the balance, but I really appreciate that story about your dad and that connection, y'all have. And that, again, the key word is relationships, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So do you feel that your podcast is providing a public service in this day and time?
Man, I have not thought of it in those kind of grand terms. I'd like to think so. That's aspirational. I know that it's helped me have more productive conversations and nurture richer relationships. So even if it's just my little corner of the world and conversations I'm having, and listen, we see the numbers. We see that, it's not a few dozen or a few hundred or even a few thousand now. It's, quite a few people are listening, and we hear from people. So I'd like to think that the kinds of conversations that we're having, the people that we're having on the program, that it is having an effect beyond me. But the thing is, even a lot of us get frustrated because we see these problems and we want to have one conversation, share the perfect information, the rhetorical comebacks, and convince that person and everybody who's listening and change a whole country and a whole world on that one conversation. And because we can't, we get frustrated. My expectation is that, if anything, I can have this one conversation with one person and maybe have 1 degree of influence, right? Or 1 degree of persuasion. But the caveat at the same time is I know that I'm much more persuasive when I'm also persuadable. When I have the disposition that is leaving room for the possibility that I'll get to the point in the conversation, what Monty Guzman says, I never thought of it that way moments, that I could be talking to somebody and learn something new about why they arrived at a position that they did that is completely alien to me, right? So if I have that disposition where I'm open, I'm radically curious in ironic, poetic, beautiful way, it makes me more persuasive, So that's all. I don't know about like having a public service. I'd like to think that we have that ability. But to me, my expectation is one person, one conversation, 1 degree at a time. And I think if we do that on a regular basis, we might get frustrated with, how little we did today. But I look back, we've been doing this thing for over 3 years now. And I'm amazed at what we've done over 3 years. So today I'm frustrated with how little, but over 3 years, holy cow, look at all we've done. You know what I mean?
Right.
So,
I know exactly what you mean. I feel the same way about this little project I call my podcast. Like I told you, it started off as a rant. And the ironic thing is the person I had a rant at, my most listened to show was somebody that believes in him wholeheartedly, right?
Okay.
You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And that guy will come on the show anytime I want him because, I treated him fairly. Again, it's if for the people listening, if you understand, and most people do, for something that they really care about, right? Because I think there's a difference between what you care about and what you're passionate about. I think that if you're passionate about something, we were talking off air about sports, the term fan is short for fanatic. And so when you're passionate about a team or something like that, even if this guy kind of sucks, you're going to root for him. And that may seem to other people unreasonable, right? But when you care about somebody, you really, you pay attention to what they're saying as opposed to, like you said earlier, thinking of the response to what they're going to say. And I think that's a lost art in politics specifically. It's been a lost art as far as religion goes, in my opinion. So again,
the art of listening, art of listening to each other.
Yeah. I just think that's when it comes to religion, it's because when you look at how divided the Christian church is, right, and then let alone anything else dealing with Islam or Judaism or even Buddhism, right, or anything else that people practice as their religious belief, it's just like we have become a society where we automatically say, okay, so you believe that and that's it, and we just cut that off. We don't even try to understand what might be the connection. You understand what I'm saying? And we're not curious even at that point when it comes to religion. We've basically been trained as once you say who you are, that's it.
That's it.
And, Christians might engage each other more, like a Baptist and a Methodist might get into, a slight debate about stuff. But really, all they want to do is just find the commonality in Christ, right? But in politics, I think it's gotten to a point now where we just, we're getting to the point now where we don't listen. Like you said, everybody's siloed in on their favorite channel or their favorite talking head or whatever. and not trying to understand. When I hear that traditions like the after session drinks in the lounge were
Yeah.
gone, or that I hear lobbyists saying, well, I'm only going to talk to the party that's in power. I'm not going to even talk to the representatives from the other party, in order to get stuff done. I think that's you're asking for failure at a particular
Yeah.
point. And so anyway, but again, I'm trying not to philosophize too much. But I say all that, Corey, to tell you that I feel where you're coming from. And
Yeah.
as somebody that has been elected, that it actually has to go through that, I really appreciate somebody like you pushing for more dialogue, which leads me to this question.
Mm-hmm.
Who do you think has the biggest obligation to unify the nation? The people, the press, or political/religious leaders?
So before you gave me the multiple choices, who do you think has the biggest obligation? My thought was me.
Okay.
That's the answer is me. There's a story of G.K. Chesterton, a great philosopher, theologian from the early part of the 20th century. And I forget if he was an Oxford guy or a Cambridge guy. But the London Times put out an article asking for responses from their readers. And the article posed the question, what's wrong with the world? G.K. Chesterton wrote back. Some of it may be mythologized, but it makes an important point. What's wrong with the world? G.K. Chesterton, erudite, brilliant writer, brilliant thinker of his time, wrote back a one-word answer: me. I am wrong with the world. So the answer is all of us, but I have very little control over all of us. I don't even have a ton of control over me, but I can work on it, right? I can work on my little corner of the world in all kinds of ways. Like, one of my favorite recent expressions that I've adapted is, that sounds like a you problem, So if somebody comes to me and says, oh, the MSM, it's terrible, and I can't get any news, there's no good news sources, blah, blah, blah. I'm thinking, that sounds like a you problem, my friend, because I can look at just about any outlet, dare I say, even like a Breitbart, and I bet I could find a good reporter there. Yes, he has editorial obligations, but there's somebody who's probably well-trained and really committed to the craft of good journalism, good reporting. And then it's a me problem because I need to filter it through what I'm reading. I know that there are editorial obligations for the outlet that this person's writing for. I know for a fact that I can get somebody tells me, oh, New York Times, you can't read anything there. Maggie Haberman, one of the best reporters, just old school gumshoe reporters in the country right now. Washington Post, Robert Costa, great journalist. Let alone like analysts and commentary and stuff like that. So whatever the issue is, whether it's the conversations that I'm having, the news that I'm getting, the impact that I'm having on the people around me, it's me. I'm most responsible for it. And curating that news and being a better consumer of news and being a better civically engaged citizen, being a better neighbor. It's on me, man. And if I just do that one little thing, it's like that old starfish thing. There were a million starfish, the story of a million starfish washed up on the shore. And this little kid was just taking one starfish, throwing it out to the ocean. One starfish, throwing it out into the ocean. Old man comes up, cynical old man like me, gray hair, like me, comes up. He said, what are you doing? There's a million starfish. You're not going to save them all? And a little kid picks one up, throws it out. I just saved that one.
Right.
Just stay, So that's all I can do, man. Just one starfish at a time,
Yeah, and I think that's the key. I look at the categories that I threw at you, And I fall, in my lifetime, I have fallen in all three of those categories as a citizen, as an elected official, even as a reporter. And like you said, it's like Michael Jackson's answer was a little longer than me, but he basically said the man in the mirror, which is the same thing.
Yeah.
We have to be accountable for what we say and what we do. And I take liberty on my show to kind of, editorialize and put my opinions out there. But I'm not naive to think that everybody's going to believe what I say. And I think a lot of our problem in this political atmosphere we're in is that either you have complete, absolute fealty to my thought, or you're not worthy. And there are some people in the United States that actually think that they're not worthy, because those are the people that don't vote. Those are the people that don't want to pay attention, because for whatever reason, either they voted for somebody they believed in and they didn't win, or they expressed an opinion and somebody, probably a relative, shot them down and hurt them. And, so that's why I think what you're doing is so important. And I really want to encourage people to pay attention to how you do it. And it's because you're not coming across as somebody that's a pie in the sky kind of dude. You're not the kumbaya kind of dude. You're a Jew from Jersey, is what you said. So,
that's right.
So kumbaya is not your thing. But I'm just joking about that. But the fact that you're dealing with it in a pragmatic way, I think is very, very helpful. And for the brief time I wanted you on this podcast, I wanted to highlight, hey, there's somebody out there that's really trying to improve the conversation. So having said all that, how can people get to your podcast? How can people get in touch with you? How can people get involved in this movement, whether you consider it a movement or not? How do you get people involved in this movement to improve the dialogue?
I appreciate you asking that. First of all, just in response to what you were just saying, your votes matter. Like, I live in California, so a lot of people say, oh, it's a foregone conclusion. Your vote doesn't really matter. Wait a second. No, my vote does matter. Like, it may be a foregone conclusion at one level, the presidential level, right? At least for the time being. But listen, Georgia, 10 years ago, they said, oh, it's a foregone conclusion. Why vote for president? It's already for. Now, it's very much in play. In fact, it's not only helped to decide the last couple of presidential elections, it's decided the Senate the last couple cycles. In my district, I live in California 27. The Republican won his House seat that represents this district by 333 votes. 333 out of over 340,000 people that voted. So my vote counts. There's always going to be some line on there, or several lines, or a lot of lines that count. So vote. Your vote counts. Your vote matters. So that I'll say that. The other thing is, how can you do it? Just try to have one conversation. Don't cede the ground of these important topics of politics and religion. It's how we figure out how to do this thing together. How do we figure out how to do life together, right? Don't cede the ground to the extremists and the screamers. Because if we're not talking to the exhausted majority, the principled majority that isn't extreme this way or that way, if we're not talking as the exhausted majority, the screamers are taking up all the oxygen out of the room. The extremists are. So it's imperative that we get involved in the conversation. But how do you get involved in the conversation? Here's the bad news. You're going to mess it up. Just like me. I'm going to mess it up in all kinds of ways. I'm amazed at how incredibly creative I can get at messing it up. But you know something? It's kind of like the guy who hits a home run might remember hitting that home run. He learns a lot more from striking out, So what is he going to do, or what is she going to do next time to maybe reduce your strikeout rate from 25% to 23%? Same thing with these conversations. What am I going to do better? It might be something like, oh, you know what? I'm usually 2 drinks in before I start having these conversations. Maybe I'll ease up and go like 1 drink in and have a glass of water instead of 2, 3 drinks in, right? It could be any arbitrary number of things. But like the idea is stay committed to the conversation, get back into the game. We need you in the game. So, and it's okay to mess it up, but stay committed to the relationship like my father was committed to me, right? So that's what I'll say. As far as how people can find me, the easiest way is to start. Our website is politicsandreligion.us. That's a podcast, the main page of the podcast, politicsandreligion.us. Or feel free to yell at me, give me a shout out or yell at me or whatever. All the social media apps that we're on, not as much on Twitter these days, but I do check it here and there. But there's 4 other ones that we're on. Might get back into TikTok at some point, but the LinkedIn and the Instagram, Facebook, Threads is my favorite one. It's Corey S. Nathan at Corey, S as in Sam, Nathan, at Corey S. Nathan.
All right, Corey Nathan. Again, man, continue doing what you're doing. You have, now that you've been on, you have an open invitation to come on the podcast whenever you want to come on. And I greatly appreciate you, man. One of the cool things about doing this is getting to meet people that are doing cool and extraordinary things. And as humble as you come across, I need you to know that what you're doing is very, very important. And I'm honored to have you as a guest, and I'm honored to know that you exist. And I pray that you continue to do this as long as you feel comfortable doing it, and because it's needed. So thank you.
That means so much to me, Eric. I deeply, deeply appreciate that, man, and I so appreciate that you. It's an honor to be included in a conversation. So thank you.
All right, guys, and we're going to catch y'all on the other side. All right, and we are back. And so now, my final guest is Leah Rothstein. Leah Rothstein is co-author with Richard Rothstein of Just Action, a sequel to The Color of Law. While in The Color of Law, Mr. Rothstein describes how government policy created residential segregation, Just Action describes how local community groups can begin to redress the wrongs of segregation. Leah has worked on public policy and community change from the grassroots to the halls of government. She has led research in reforming community corrections policy and practice to be focused on rehabilitation, not punishment, and has been a consultant to nonprofit housing developers, cities and counties, redevelopment agencies, and private firms on community development and affordable housing policy, practice, and finance. Her policy work is informed by her years as a labor and community organizer. She lives in Oakland in the San Francisco Bay Area. Ladies and gentlemen, it's my distinct honor and privilege to have as a guest on this podcast, Leah Rothstein. All right, Leah Rothstein. How you doing, ma'am? You doing good?
I'm doing great. Yeah, how are you?
I'm doing lovely. I am really honored to have you on. I have been following you for a little bit, and what got my attention was the work that your dad had done, and one of the things he alludes to is that he had to talk to an expert when it came to housing, and it happened to be you.
So you didn't have to look too far.
Right. So I'm very, very honored to have you come on. Now, one of the things I like to do is, to start the interview, is to offer a quote. Now, it's either something that you said, something that's written in a book, or something related. So here's your quote. As citizens in this democracy, we, all of us, white, black, Hispanic, Asian, Native American, and others, bear a collective responsibility to enforce our Constitution and to rectify past violations whose effects endure. Few of us may be the direct descendants of those who perpetuated a segregated system or those who were its most exploited victims. African Americans cannot await rectification of past wrongs as a gift, and white Americans collectively do not owe it to African Americans to rectify them. We, all of us, owe this to ourselves. As American citizens, whatever routes we or other particular ancestors took to get to this point, we are all in this together now. What does that quote mean to you?
It speaks to our obligation as a country to address racial discrimination, racial segregation, and that it's not, as the quote said, it's not a gift we give each other, but it's a moral and constitutional obligation to rectify, remedy the situation, and it hurts all of us to continue to ignore it.
Do you recognize who might have said that?
Me and my dad together?
Yeah.
Or him?
Yeah, I got it from his book, The Color of Law.
Yeah.
But when I read that, I had another quote for you, and then I read that, and I was like, that's pretty profound. I like that one. I'm gonna get her to respond to that one. What got you started or inspired you to be an organizer and then later on to become a consultant dealing with housing discrimination?
Well, let's see. It starts pretty far back. Obviously, I was raised by parents who were involved in these issues and in thinking and acting in the political sphere. My parents were both activists my whole life growing up, so I grew up thinking that was normal and that's what you grow up to do. When you see something wrong in your community or society, you grow up, you become an adult, and then you use like the power that you have to affect change on it. And so I also, naively as a child, thought that when I got to be college age, there would be a national social movement that I could join. Like my parents joined the civil rights movement, the anti-Vietnam War movement, the early women's movement, and I later learned they didn't just join a movement, they created a movement. And so when I got to be college age, I realized I had to do that also if I wanted to be involved in something that could affect change larger than myself. And so I got involved in college organizing, primarily to defend affirmative action in California, and then went on to be a community and labor organizer, and then wanted to have a bigger impact. And the issues that seemed to underlie all of the sort of racial equity issues I was working on and concerned with come down to the communities we live in and what kind of resources we have access to based on where we live. And so I got interested in housing policy, community development policy. And then my dad wrote The Color of Law, and it was very powerful. It sort of changed the narrative in the country a bit about how we understand why we're a segregated country, that it wasn't just an accident or private actors or a natural occurrence, but it was caused explicitly and intentionally by the government. And then once we recognized that, many readers of The Color of Law, myself included, asked him, well, what do we do with this? How do we change it now? Even if we understand that the government caused it, doesn't seem to be fixing it anytime soon. So what can we do? And so I asked him that, and he challenged me to help him answer that question. And so that's where Just Action came from. Okay.
And to go back, so in the book, The Color of Law, which was written by your father, Richard, and that book debunked the myth that de facto segregation was the primary cause for housing discrimination. He stressed a very important theme that discrimination in the United States has been unconstitutional since the enactment of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. Why do you think Americans, more specifically American political leaders, don't comprehend that?
I think it's difficult to comprehend that, if you comprehend that, if you accept that as fact, then you have an obligation to do something different. And I think that there's an avoidance to that in our country of facing up to that obligation. And so instead, we say, well, sure, those things happened in the past. It's too bad. But look at us now. We're a race-blind society. We don't have to worry about those issues anymore. They're over. We don't enact laws like that anymore. And it's actually, not true. There's a lot of laws that have discrimination kind of built into them or that have a discriminatory impact now, even if they don't have a discriminatory intent. And there's a lot of repercussions and consequences that we continue to live with from the actions of our government in the past that we have an obligation to remedy and to address.
Yeah. When I was thinking about how I would answer that question, the phrase political expediency came to mind. I think a lot of having been in a legislative body, my experience has been that a lot of these decisions, even when we basically got on the floor and challenged and said, I think this is unconstitutional what we're trying to do. It was more important to score that political point. It was more important to feed a base rather than fulfill our obligation of staying within the Constitution. How do you feel about when you hear somebody like me say that? What do you think?
What it brings to mind for me is this sort of cycle that we've created for ourselves where we're so separate and polarized and made to believe that something that serves the interests of another race automatically will harm me. And so we're at odds on all of these issues. When the fact is, and so it's a cycle that feeds itself. So then we don't support these solutions that actually lift everyone up because we think that, it's a zero-sum game, that if someone else benefits, I must lose. And we can't challenge that idea because we don't live around each other. We don't live around people of different races. We don't know each other socially to a large extent. And so the cycle just feeds itself. So that's what that brought up for me. And that, in fact, we do these sort of solutions that we talk about in Just Action that will redress segregation. They help everyone. Our entire country is harmed by maintaining and perpetuating racial segregation. Clearly, African Americans are harmed the most, but we're all harmed by this system. And so if we continue to think that it's a zero-sum game, that if we solve something that disproportionately impacts African Americans, that whites will suffer, then we'll never sort of get beyond the polarization that we live with today.
So you've already stated that the motivation for the book was answering a question that was being directed to your dad and at different forums, and even a question that you asked yourself, what can we do about it now? Why did you feel compelled to answer that question, right? In a book form? Why did that need to be expressed in that form?
Yeah, well, to be honest, I wasn't convinced initially that I should work on this book with him. And so it took me a little while. And so I was convinced eventually because I agree with my dad that, there's a lot of people in this country who have an appetite to do something about this, who are interested in racial equality. 20 million people marched in Black Lives Matter demonstrations in 2020. And then they went home and put up lawn signs on their front lawns. And, we think part of the reason they didn't do more, is particularly around challenging the segregation of their communities, is because they didn't know what to do. And so I eventually was convinced because my dad had a platform from The Color of Law. 1 million people bought that book. And it felt like it would be a disservice for me to not help use that platform to get the solutions out there. and to help people understand that there's actually a lot that can be done in their own communities to challenge and remedy segregation. And if we think one reason they're not doing that people aren't advocating for those kinds of changes is because they don't know what to do, and we have some answers of what they can do, I feel like it was my sort of duty to help provide those answers.
And before, because that kind of segues into my next question, but before I ask it, I live in the Atlanta area now, and I have seen the Black Lives Matter signs, but I also saw signs that were popping up around the election time that kept saying everything was going to be okay. And I was like, okay, that's comforting, but what exactly is being done to make sure that everything is okay? So I just wanted to throw that aside. So the question I have is, would it be a fair statement to say that the main essence of just action is to show that there are a lot of smaller pieces of the puzzle that create segregation, and many groups are working on one piece at a time?
Yeah, that's exactly right. So what we say in Just Action is, even though the federal government had a large role to play in creating segregation in the mid-20th century, once created, to a large extent, it's maintained, enforced, perpetuated by local government, local policies. So by forming groups in our own communities, biracial, multi-ethnic groups, forming relationships that cross racial lines, and then using those groups to advocate for change locally, there's a lot that we can actually advocate for and change and adopt or implement that will go a long way towards challenging the racial segregation of our communities and remedying its impacts. And so we give dozens of examples of those things that local groups can advocate for, all that are controlled on the local level, either by government, institutions, banks, for example, but all things that a local group can organize around and advocate for. And then for all of those dozens of strategies we give an example of a community somewhere in the country that's working on that or has successfully implemented it. So we want to show, yes, there's a lot that can be done. And look, it's already happening. There's people doing it. It's not impossible.
All right. So one thing you highlight in the book is that for every $100 a white family receives in income, a black family receives $60. Yet for every $100 of white household wealth, a black household has $5. Break down how housing segregation has impacted those numbers.
Yeah, great question. So those numbers are staggering, right? You would think that if you make around the same amount of money, you should be able to save around the same amount of money. So while the income disparity between blacks and whites is concerning and should be addressed with other policy changes, you would think that the wealth disparity would be about the same as the income disparity, but it's obviously not. It's a lot bigger. And the main driver for that wealth disparity goes back to the government policies in the mid-20th century that created homeownership opportunities, made them affordable, and subsidized those homeownership buying experiences, and limited that opportunity to whites. So the federal government after World War II helped finance the suburbanization of the country, helped subsidize developers to build suburbs and subdivisions all over the country, and then sell those homes at affordable prices, about $100,000 in today's money. But the developers could only get that federal subsidy if they agreed and promised to only sell their homes to whites. And indeed, they had to put a covenant on the deed of the homes they built that said the home could only ever be owned or occupied by whites. So the white families, they also could get subsidized mortgages from the federal government. They bought those homes. They were affordable. Those homes increased in value exponentially. They no longer cost $100,000. They cost several hundred, some places over $1 million. So those white families got rich through their home ownership experience, subsidized by the federal government. Now those families, their children, their grandchildren have wealth that they can invest in their own homes, for example. African Americans, through no fault of their own, don't have that intergenerational wealth because they were explicitly prohibited from the home ownership experience when it was subsidized and affordable. And so because of those past policies, we have this wealth disparity today that just keeps Hasn't gotten any smaller, even after the passage of the Fair Housing Act in 1968, which said we can no longer discriminate in the sale of or rental of housing. But when you already have decades of that wealth building in white communities and wealth denial in black communities, we have this disparity that already exists. So even though anyone can buy homes in these suburbs now, whites are far more likely to be able to afford it, because even with the same incomes, black families don't have that intergenerational wealth for the down payment. So if we want to address the consequences of those unconstitutional actions of our government that created this situation, we need to address the wealth gap. One way we can do that is through providing subsidies to African American homebuyers, down payment assistance, grants, no interest loans, to address that gap that exists in the ability to pay for a home now that African Americans uniquely have compared to whites because of these past government policies.
Yeah, because, when I think of, I spent most of my time in Mississippi. I grew up in Chicago, lived in Mississippi the majority of my life, and then now I'm here in Atlanta. And so, when I think about what you talk about, one, by the time the Fair Housing Act passed, you're basically talking about a 20-year head start for folks. And it's like in Jackson, there's an area in the north side of town that has a historical marker that says GI subdivision, right? Now, you go there now, it's all black. It's an all black neighborhood. But when it was built, like you said, it was all white. And it was north of downtown. And of course the city grew and expanded into all that area. And I just think about what a difference it would have made if those black families that are living there now were second or third generation living in those homes. How Jackson itself, a city, one of the poorest cities in America, in the poorest state in America, how that would have been transformative, right? In the book, you state that many have lost the aspiration for a non-segregated society. Elaborate on that point.
Mm-hmm. Well, there are sort of fewer forces in sort of on the left in the civil rights movement to push for a desegregated society. There's a lot of belief that, well, we should just be separate. We should advocate for well-resourced all black communities. We clearly haven't solved segregation by now, so maybe this is just how it is. And we argue in Just Action that that's kind of not good enough. That there should be well-resourced African American communities, middle income, all black communities, if that's where people want to live. But the problem is that there hasn't been free choice to be able to live in those kinds of communities, or for those who want to live in well-resourced, wider communities, for there to be access to those communities. And so we argue that, in order to sort of solve this issue of not having free choice in where to live, and the fact that even middle-income African-American communities are actually less well-resourced than similarly incomed white communities. Those middle-income African-American communities, they tend to soon become less all-black. More whites move in if they actually do have access to resources and opportunity, and they tend to be closer to lower income communities and have sort of even a higher poverty rate than middle income white communities. So that we've never had separate but equal in this country. And so acknowledging that fact, then we need to find ways to create well-resourced communities that everyone has access to equally.
Yeah. So, everybody that's really in tune with history and politics always talks about the Lincoln-Douglas debates as one of as kind of like the premier debate in dealing with the subject of slavery. But in the black community, one of the, if not the most important debate was between Booker T. Washington and W.B. Du Bois. And it was on this very issue. Whereas Booker T. Washington was an advocate of, hey, as long as we are given the opportunity to build our own stuff and create our own businesses and all that, and those other folks don't mess with us, we'll be okay. And W.B. Du Bois was like, we're kind of selling ourselves short if we don't do that. So that's been an argument in the Black community for literally our existence, or at least our existence since slavery, right? And so when I saw that you addressed it, I was like, oh, wow. Okay. So I definitely wanted to get you to articulate that on the air. And like I stated, you lived in Chicago for a little bit. I'm a native of Chicago, so I'm a little biased on one particular story in the book. Talk about Tanika Lewis Johnson and the Map Twins.
Yeah, this is a great story. Tanika Johnson is an artist in Chicago, an activist artist. She wanted to do a art project that illustrated segregation, the segregation of Chicago. So she took the unique layout of the city, which is laid out on a perfect grid. So the north side and the south side of the same street have the same house numbers. And the north side of town is almost all white, the south side of town almost all black. She took the map and folded it in half. And when you fold it in half, the houses with the same numbers on the north and south side of the street sit perfectly on top of each other. And she called those homes map twins. And then she took photographs of those homes to show, a visual representation of segregation. The homes themselves weren't that different, but the context they exist in, very different because of the consequences of segregation in those communities. So she did a photographic exhibit of that called the Folded Map Project. And then she went a step further and introduced herself to the residents of those homes and told them about her project and asked them if they wanted to meet their map twin. Many of them said yes. Many of these people had lived in Chicago their whole lives. They didn't know someone from the other side of town. They had never been there. So by participating in Tanika's project, they agreed to meet their map twin and tour each other's neighborhoods, give their map twin a tour of their neighborhood and go on a tour of their map twin's neighborhood. So people met people from the other race side of town. They learned about their neighborhoods. They developed relationships. They learned that they're not all that different. They have the same sort of aspirations and hopes and challenges, but their communities are very different. The resources they have access to are very different. So then they went on to many of them to form what they called block twin groups. Whole blocks got together, supported each other. They did some neighborhood beautification efforts and some mutual support during the pandemic. So we use that story as an example because we argue in Just Action that to enact the changes we see we need to do on the local level is we're going to need local groups that are biracial and multi-ethnic to advocate for those changes. We need leadership that's both Black and white and membership that's biracial and multi-ethnic. And to do that, we need to take some intentional steps to meet and build relationships with people of other races because we live in such segregated communities. We often don't have those natural social contact with people of other races. So we have to take some extra steps. So what Tanika did was an example of some extra steps you can take to meet people sort of across the racial divide in your city. And it doesn't take a city laid out on a perfect grid. You don't need that to create that kind of initiative. I've also written in our Substack column about another group in San Diego that does that, without the sort of gimmick of the map. And there's groups all over the country that are starting to address this issue and try to bring people together from segregated parts of town to just start building relationships and networking and getting to know each other. And that, we argue, is the essential first step towards building the movement we need to enact these changes.
Yeah, and I greatly appreciate that story being highlighted because it vindicates something I've been telling people all my life, is that you can grow up in Chicago and not have to interact with people of another race if you do not want to, right? I mean, It was like, okay, just say, for example, Sears, right? If there was a Sears in the Black community and there was one on 63rd Street near Halstead, it was nothing but Black people that worked at that Sears. So All the customers were black, all the people that worked there were black, and you dealt with weather, and you go north, say, I don't know, Ogden Avenue, whatever. I don't know if there's a Sears up there or not. I just throw that out there. It's like, or you can say over there by Wrigley Field, right? Addison, that area over there. If there was a Sears over there, probably be all white. If you went over in the Pilsner neighborhood, it'd probably be all Latino. You know what I'm saying? So it's like, you growing up in Chicago, the only way you really interacted with other people is if you went downtown, went to a sporting event, or you were involved in some kind of activity like sports where you would have to engage with people from different cultures. Other than that, you didn't have to do that. So that story not only justified what I told people, but it showed a very creative way of how people that are not political leaders can reach out and interact and make change in their community. So I fell in love with that story. I thought that was brilliant.
Yeah.
So give the audience, you kind of gave one example already. Give the audience an example of a purposeful policy to reverse racial housing discrimination. And you already mentioned a subsidy program. What else would you like to see either a state or a federal government address?
Well, there's so many. I have a whole book of them. Let's see. One example from the book is community land trust. So community land trusts are nonprofit organizations. We wrote about one in Durham, North Carolina. It started when a group of residents in a lower income African-American neighborhood just started going door to door, talking to each other about what they could do to improve things in their neighborhood. The first thing that they talked about was wanting a park. There wasn't a park. Kids were playing in the street, and a child had been hit by a car. And so they advocated that the city turned a vacant lot in their area into a park. And they won. They got the park. And so they were excited and started thinking, what else could they do? And their neighborhood was gentrifying. They're near Duke University, which was expanding. And so investors were buying up properties. So they learned about the land trust model. So land trusts are, as I said, nonprofit organizations. They're run by local community. Usually a third of their board members are from their homes and their community, at least a third. And they have usually the dual goals of creating permanently affordable home ownership opportunities and preventing displacement in areas with rising housing costs. And they can do that because they acquire land. Usually local governments can donate vacant land. Local governments are sitting on vacant land all over the place. They have foreclosed properties or unused public land. So this Durham group, they got the city of Durham to donate 2 vacant lots. They fixed up the houses on them, or 2 vacant homes. They fixed up the homes. And then they sold them at affordable prices to lower and moderate income households. And they can sell them at affordable prices because in the transaction, the land trust retains ownership of the land underneath the house. So they just sell the home. So it's a more affordable price. And then the homeowners own the home like anyone else. And when they want to resell it, they have to adhere to a maximum resale price. And that maximum price helps them earn some equity, but ensures that the home price is affordable to the next home buying family. So in this neighborhood in Durham, they now have over 300 properties. Their homes sell for $150,000 in a neighborhood where homes are $500,000. So they've really created affordable home ownership opportunities in a neighborhood that's gotten very expensive. And they also prevented a lot of displacement in that neighborhood when it was gentrifying. Most of the blocks where the land trust has homes are still African American, and the blocks where the land trust couldn't beat out the investors, those have gentrified and most of the residents are white. So this land trust model, it has taken off. There's over 300 communities with a land trust around the country. It's not, the only answer, but it's one piece of the puzzle to create permanently affordable home ownership opportunities for people who otherwise wouldn't be able to afford to buy a home in these communities and prevent some of the displacement that can occur when housing prices rise. And what we can do with that as members of our community, aside from supporting a land trust personally, with our own donations or time, is collectively advocate that our local governments and institutions use their vacant land this way, donate some of it to a land trust to increase and, build their portfolio of homes. We also suggest in Just Action that, a lot of communities are researching the restrictive covenants on the homes in their area. Those are the covenants on the deeds of home that the homes that the federal government required developers to include that said the home could only ever be owned or occupied by whites. Those are no longer legally enforceable, but they remain on the deeds of homes forever. So a lot of communities have undergone sort of research campaigns or efforts where they've inventoried and identified all of these restrictive covenants just to show how intentional the segregation of these communities were. Now, those restrictive covenants are on the deeds of the homes. The deeds also usually name the companies that were first involved with building that home when it was first sold on a discriminatory basis. So the bank that financed it, the builder and developer, the realtor that first sold it. In many communities, those companies, those banks and builders, developers, realtors are still in business or have been acquired by other companies that are still in business in our communities. So a local group advocating for the redress of segregation could find those companies by looking on the deeds of these homes. And many of them have, since 2020, put up statements on their websites denouncing racism and promising to do better. So we can advocate that they actually live up to those statements and take actions to remedy some of the segregation they helped to create. One way they could do that is helping support land trusts, donating land to a land trust, for example, or donating homes to a land trust. So that's one idea of a strategy that a local community can take on or help to grow.
All right, Leah. So you said your dad sold 1 million copies. We're going to try to get you to sell 2. How can people?
Right.
How can people get your book, and how can people reach out to you?
Yeah, the book is available anywhere books are sold, including on Audible. We have a website, justactionbook.org. You can contact me that way and see about all of our events coming up. I'll be traveling around the country a lot this spring talking about Just Action, so all of our public events are there. We also have a Substack column I mentioned briefly where we're continuing to update the things we wrote about in Just Action and add to them because all of this is constantly changing and evolving. So you can subscribe for free to that column. It's at justaction.substack.com.
Well, Leah Rothstein, I greatly appreciate the work and the legacy that you are perpetuating between the work your dad did and now that you are doing. It is really, really helpful. And, one of the cool things about this podcast is that people I can notice that are doing some great things, but they're doing it kind of like at the, they're not like on national TV every day or anything like that. But it needs to be highlighted. And to me, when we talk to people like you, it gives people hope. So I really, really am honored that you came on the podcast, and I'm really, really proud of the work that you're doing, and I hope that you are able to continue to do it so that we can fulfill our commitment in America to make sure that everybody has an equal opportunity to live life and live life abundantly. So thank you.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate being here.
All right, guys, and we're going to catch y'all on the other side. All right, and we are back. So I just want to thank my guests for coming on, Corey and Leah. And again, I hope that you gained some insight and some inspiration as far as doing what needs to be done in this political climate. And I know, I watch the news, at least the national news, every day. And we're going through some peaks and some valleys. But, the political landscape is pretty clear now. I think those of us who listen to this podcast know what choice needs to be made, and knows who should not ever be in office ever again, right? And, and it's really, really important, guys, regardless of who you vote for, that you engage and you vote. But I encourage my listeners to look at the big picture, where we're at. What do we want to see done? One of the funny things, real quick, I'm a big Bears fan. And one of the big decisions that they're trying to make is, do they want to stay with what they got, or do they want the new shiny object in front of them? But their objective is to win the championship. Regardless of what decision they make, that's what they're trying to do. And I think that when we go to the polls on the first Tuesday in November 2024, we need to have a clear vision of what we want. I want an America where democracy still exists, whether you call it democracy or democratic republic or representative government. I want what we got to stay, with the potential of it getting better. I don't want to go back. I don't want to go back to a time that I never lived in. I want to keep moving forward, and I want it to exist so that my child and other children and maybe even grandchildren can enjoy and benefit from. That's my mindset, and I hope the people who are listening to this podcast have that same mindset. So with that, thank you for listening, and until next time.